Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the final session of Interact Global 2021. Firstly, I'd like to say a massive thanks to Angel Brown for her talk this morning, and Zoe and our wonderful panelists, Felicia Williams, Sophie Dennis, and Jan de Schepper, for a great discussion on design leadership earlier. Also, a big thanks to every speaker who's joined us this week, and all of you for tuning in. We hope you found the every session insightful and useful. So, for our final session, we have joining us all the way from California, Melanie Yencken, UX design lead at Google, with her talk, How to Build Inclusive Team Culture. This talk will cover how managers and leaders can create inclusion in their team through building team trust and psychological safety, cultivating diverse perspectives, and providing equal opportunities to your team members. As always, say hello to each other in the chat and join in the discussion. Make sure your chat settings are switched to panelists and attendees so everyone can see our messages, and do let us know if there's any issues with audio or the stream or anything like that, and we'll get that sorted as soon as we can. Please submit your questions for Melanie using the Q&A box. I'll get through as many as I can at the end. And finally, as always, we're using auto-generated captions. If they're not 100% accurate live, please do bear with us. We will make sure that these are accurate when we make these talks publicly available. So yeah, without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Melanie.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be joining you all here from California. You'll probably see the sunrise behind me in that window as we speak today. So yeah, I'm going to be talking today about creating inclusive team culture. And just a little shout out, I'm using an awesome free resource in this presentation, which are inclusive illustrations from humans.com, humans with 3 A's. So check those out if you've got a presentation coming up soon. So yeah, as Henry said, I'm Melanie Yencken, and I lead some design teams at Google who work across Google My Business, which is a tool that lets you get your business on Google Search and Maps. And I'm also a founder of a women's network called London Tech Ladies. So today we're going to be talking about inclusion, but why? Why should we be discussing this? It's really important topic to myself personally, having been a woman in tech for a while. I've experienced fairly non-inclusive environments quite a few times and have struggled in various ways because I felt like I've been the only person in that room who looks like me. And so I kind of got very passionate about this. And what I've seen is that when inclusion is actually properly set up in a team, you have this amazing environment. But what does that actually mean? So that's when everyone's unique identity and experiences are respected, valued, and fully integrate into how we operate as a business. And that these differences will actually improve the culture and collaboration and innovation. And then that trickles into meaning the products and services improve. So that, and then the material revenue of a business can improve. And there's a lot of research that shows that. So this is like what we want to work towards. But today, unfortunately, we're not anywhere near being inclusive. We are making progress. But there is a great report that I check every year, which is the McKinsey Women in the Workplace report. And they basically are going year on year and surveying, I think it's like 590 different companies employing 22 million people. And they're looking at the pipeline of talent, and they're looking at how diverse that talent pipeline is. And what you can see at like entry level, that you have about 47% women, unfortunately, and only 18% women of color. And this is US data, just a caveat. And then as soon as you start moving higher in the ladder, you see those numbers get less and less. And so what I really focus on is not the recruitment and kind of entry level. I'm focusing on once we have people in the door, what are we doing to ensure that they can actually progress up this pipeline and then we don't lose people at such a high attrition like you see here? So what this materially affects is what we call the broken rung. So for every 100 men who are promoted in the year, only 85 women are promoted, and just 71 Latina women and 58 Black women. So there's something really wrong with how opportunities are being provided for this diverse talent to actually move up the ladder. And what we also see is that women remain significantly outnumbered at the manager level. And at the beginning of 2020, women held just 38% of manager positions, while men held 62%. So if you don't have equality at the management level, that's where a lot of decisions are actually being made. So I'm talking here about what we can do to kind of improve as leadership to make sure that people can move up this ladder at a fair pace. So why am I talking about the role of a manager? Because I really believe that in creating inclusion and equality in a team sits with the manager. The manager is a model of behavior. Our behavior matters. So the way that I act in my team, that behavior is almost like a mirror. I see then individuals doing that because they see what I'm doing as an example. And it's like this whole, like, actions are more impactful than words. Like, yes, I can say something, but whatever I'm actually doing, that is what I see people replicate. So we have to be really hyper conscious that, like, whatever we are portraying or doing, then that's going to kind of then mirror across the organization. And then unfortunately, what that means is then our biases matter as a manager. And so anything that we're unconscious or consciously biased with, then that will trickle down into our teams, our allocation of work, the way that we recognize and promote people. So having to be hyper conscious of what biases we have as a manager is important. Because ultimately, individuals actually experience the company through their manager. Like, Google is like 150,000 people. Like, we do have strong values and those are understood, but it's a large company. So what you tend to get are like subcultures that exist within each team. And that is really well established by the manager or the leader of that area. And it's, largely established by the actions and the things that they do. So this is really important for us to make sure that the manager is conscious of what they are doing to set the culture for their team. So for me, I have three main pillars of this, setting up this inclusion. Firstly, I look at how we build the team trust and respect. And secondly, how we cultivate diverse perspective in the team. And finally, how we actually make sure we are providing equal opportunities to everyone. So let's dig into trust and respect. So trust and respect to me actually means psychological safety. So Google, most of your work is done in teams. And so we had a team in People Ops who decided to go out and actually research teams and determine if there was a certain team dynamic or individual characteristic of a team that could be associated with someone who's highly effective. And the teams really differentiated on effectiveness because of how team members interacted with each other, much less by who was in the team. And psychological safety was the one most important and foundational characteristic that they saw in the dynamics that characterize an effective team. So we have now a lot of focus on how making sure teams have psychological safety and what they're doing to improve that. So what is psychological safety? Let's dig into that a little bit. There's a really, really great series of talks by Amy Edmondson, and you can go and have a look at, just check her one on YouTube, Psychological Safety in the Workplace. And she describes it well. She says the best performing teams make the most mistakes because they're able to talk about them with honesty. When issues arise, it's about the team, not the individual, and they focus on the learning. So this is, to me, a great characterization of psychological safety, where we are able to speak up and share our points of view. And this is why you have diverse people in the room, because they will think about something from a different perspective, because they have a very different perspective. They've grown up or experienced different things. And if they're not able to speak up about those concerns or their ideas, because they feel like they might be attacked as a person rather than them focusing about, the idea itself. So let's talk about how you can create this psychological safety, because the reality is that we get in our own way. Like, we would all love to work in a place that's judgment free, but our human nature stops us from doing that. So I'll talk about my experience when I first joined Google, probably when I've joined any company really. So when I first joined, Google's this place, and I'm meeting people like, oh yeah, I launched Chrome and I launched Android, and I'm just like, oh my God, the imposter syndrome was crazy. I'm also a massive perfectionist. I have been forever, and I have a fear of failure. Like, I want to succeed. So when I go into this environment, what you tend to do in the beginning is focus on being accepted as a person rather than being yourself, because you don't want to, rock the boat. You don't want to, make wild waves in the ocean. So that perfectionism, that fear of failure, that imposter syndrome, that means you spend all of your energy in just like trying to follow the trend rather than just being able to be yourself. And how that kind of materializes is, if you don't want to seem ignorant, then you don't ask questions. If you don't want to seem incompetent, then you won't admit to your own weaknesses. If you don't want to be intrusive, you won't offer your ideas. You don't want to be negative, you won't challenge the status quo. And all of those things on the right-hand side are essential for a team to operate effectively and to find, where they're going to fail and to, pivot and change their direction, because we need to be asking questions. We need to admit if someone in the team has a certain weakness so we can compensate for that. We all have to offer our ideas, and we have to continually challenge what we're doing to make sure it's the right thing. So to actually build that trust, we've got a few techniques. So for me, I focus on the team. How do we build team empathy and trust? And how do we give the team permission to fail? So earlier I introduced myself very quickly. And actually that level of introduction is the kind of introduction you might get to a colleague. Say you're about to work with a new team and you're just meeting on a virtual call, and they give you like a 10-second introduction. And then you're expected to work together, to collaborate, to challenge each other, but you don't even know who they are. You don't know the whole person. You just know this work facade. So like, really, could you trust me? Like, do you actually know who I am? Could we work together after this base level of introduction? I would say no. I'd say we would struggle. So there's some information that I get my teams to share with each other so that they can understand who they are. And in this virtual world, it's even more important that we make effort to spend this time doing this, because we don't get to meet in person in the way that we used to. So here's some techniques of what we do to kind of understand each other as people. And this is an exercise called Who Am I at Work, which is just like a template I made for the team, and everyone fills it in. We did a little personality survey. So I was the commander. It's a 16 personality survey. And then I share like strengths I have, or my areas for growth, my way I like to communicate. And this is all about me at work, where I work best, the way I like to get feedback given to me, all my weekly must-haves. And so everyone shares this, and this is just like, okay, well, if I'm working with someone, this is some cues can help me understand like what's the best way to work with that person. So that's good. That gives you a base level to like, how do you collaborate in the workspace? But I still might not trust this person because I don't actually know them as a human being. So the next thing you try to do is understand like, who is this person outside of work? I'm going to give you a lightning version of my talk of this that I do. And I hope you can see the difference of like trusting me before and after. So as I said, I'm Mel, but I love burgers. I've moved to the burger, I've moved to California, and I'm eating every kind of burger possible. I collect burgers. I made that burger footstool. I don't know when it started, but I'm just a mad burger fan. Then another thing that I do, I love making super elaborate gingerbread, and I compete with myself every year to make something more and more elaborate, and almost made it onto Great British Bake Off, but now I live in the States, so sadly won't be able to pursue that dream. I recently got married to my lovely husband in Somerset and have a few fur babies that I absolutely love. And finally, I am obsessed with renovating properties. In the UK, we've flipped 4 different properties in 4 years, and lots of DIY and mess. And you can see my husband and I, they're struggling to excavate a patio in our garden. So that was a very quick thing, but probably there was one thing in that you either resonated with, or you found funny, or you do yourself. And if you and I were to meet, we would be able to have a conversation about that thing and build a bond or a shared connection over something that isn't about work. And that mutual interest would actually enable us to have some trust, so that if you wanted to offer an idea or challenge something that I was doing, you would feel more comfortable to do that because we understand each other a bit as people. So we have to keep topping up this level of trust. So another activity that I do with the team is a little like check-in, check-out tool. Everyone can use this. It's a free website called TS Check, and it just generates these awesome questions for you to use at the start or at the end of a meeting. And you go around the room, and I just use this as a great tool to actually connect as humans before we jump into the work. So I love this question. It's like, what are you going to leave behind to be more present in this meeting? Like, what's something that you have on your mind? And then another exercise that I do is getting the team to show appreciation and compassion. Google's pretty good at that. We have a program where you can actually award peer bonuses to individuals. You can get a number of them you're allowed to use every 3 months. So we have lots of like recognition and people acknowledging each other and literally giving each other awards. But we try to also just run team exercises where we express appreciation or gratitude, because acknowledging and appreciating each other shows compassion. And lots of research shows that compassion towards each other supports and promotes a culture of respect and inclusion. Okay, so importantly, the last point in this section is this permission to fail. How do we get the team to reframe failures as learnings? Because failures are good, but the word failure there's like negative, and there's so many connotations to that. But really, failures are great because we've learned something, and ideally we fail quickly, and then we don't spend a lot of time going down a path that's unsuccessful. So we try to have this tales of fail, where we share 5-minute stories of key failures we've had to try and celebrate and humanize the concept of failing. Okay, so second pillar, how do we cultivate diverse perspective in the team? So in this virtual world, we meet. We're in meetings all day. I don't know about you, especially as a manager, all you do is you're in meetings. So if we make meetings inclusive, we're going to go a long way to making the workplace inclusive. So there's just some basic principles for improving meeting inclusion. Just making sure you have clarity around the meeting agenda. How do you reduce interruptions and dominance? And how, not everyone has to speak up, but everyone should have the opportunity, and you should be facilitating that. So some of these sound basic, but I'm shocked at how many times I go to meetings where there aren't some of these things being done. So firstly is this agenda. Like, this sounds so obvious, but I will literally decline a meeting if there's no agenda, because I don't understand like what is going to be the purpose of that meeting. How am I supposed to show up? How am I supposed to attend? What's going to be my role there? And that's the same for every other individual who's joining. So share the meeting purpose, the agenda, and share the materials, especially if you're presenting something new. Research shows that people who are introverted take a lot more time than extroverted people to feel comfortable to speak about new information, because they take more time to process it, internalize it, and then develop questions and their own insights on that material. So it's a lot harder to get reactions from people in real time if they're seeing that stuff for the first time in the meeting. So share the material in advance. And then after, circulate the notes and the follow-ups and the insights for people who maybe they were there, but they were distracted, or they're just having a bad day and they want to check in on this later. And the amount of times this doesn't happen, it shocks me. Okay, so then importantly, when we're in the room, how do we mitigate the bias? And everyone can play this part. How do we balance the playing field with some ground rules, like no talking over each other, or going around the table when you're seeking input on critical decisions? And then take the worst offenders aside and point out their behavior. They're probably unaware of it. In real time, you can kind of recognize when an idea has been shared by someone else and restated and amplify it. Give ownership back to the person who said that idea originally, because research shows that people from minority backgrounds or underrepresented groups tend to not be heard the first time they say something. And then, just call out interruptions if you see them and return the room back to someone else and say, hey, Sasha wasn't talking, like, let's return the floor back to Sasha. Okay, so then, not all of us are happy to speak up. So how do we create ways for people to contribute, especially for those more introverted? So we do this using other ways to communicate, and the best are written forms. So we have like an online doc where everyone can type their input, or if I'm going to ask for questions, I might go through the list alphabetically in the room so everyone gets a chance to unmute, even if it's just to say, hey, I don't have anything to contribute. They all know that they're going to have a chance to speak uninterrupted. Or just give everyone 2 minutes to write up their questions and post them in the chat. If you give people a break to think, you will get 10 times the amount of contribution than if you ask people to suddenly spontaneously ask questions. Okay, but finally, in meetings, we need to teach our teams how to listen. and this is like, it sounds obvious, but most of the time when you're listening at work, you're not active listening. You are listening to respond. So that means your brain is listening to the words and at the same time thinking about what you need to say next. And that means you're not actually concentrating on what the person is saying. So to practice active listening, sometimes we partner up our teams and get them to talk. One person has to talk about their problem for 2 minutes uninterrupted, and the other person just has to stand there and listen. And that is so hard to do. And it shows them just how much they don't actively listen without an intention to respond, and what the difference is in those listening techniques. So it's just one thing to educate your teams on and to practice. Okay, finally, how do we provide equal opportunities to those in the team? So a lot of this as a manager, as a leader, is about busting your own bias. And like, what biases do you have that might be stopping you from providing equal opportunities? And what tools could we be using to mitigate that and make it fairer all the time? So firstly, I like to call it bias without blame. Literally everyone has a bias. It's human nature. It's okay, as long as we take the time to understand and manage them. Some common biases that we see is that we tend to favor people we like, and we tend to like people who look like us. We tend to give opportunities to those who we deem competent, who display, the classic signs of competency. And so that means people who are already competent get the opportunities to, continue to progress, whereas those who may be quieter, who haven't had the opportunities to stretch but could be competent, aren't the first people that we think about for an opportunity. So one of the things that we have at Google is that all managers and decision makers in any kind of promotion or performance decision have to do unconscious bias training. And there's something else we implemented recently, is that in any promotion discussions and performance decisions, we have a person in the room whose role is to mitigate bias. So they are literally supposed to interrupt conversations and say, hey, I think that comment was, you referenced the reason why someone was out on leave, and that is introducing bias into this discussion. So we need to disregard that comment, and we need to, not use that kind of terminology in this room. So they literally just play the role of trying to bust the bias and say, well, where things are maybe inappropriate, or what we could do with the language to make it more inclusive. So that's one thing you can do. The other thing as a manager, as a leader, is to recognize the reality of, what we operated in this environment. The reality is, in tech in general, or probably in any workplace, if you don't ask for something, you're generally not going to get it. Like, if you don't ask, you don't get. And what does that mean? If you don't just get handed promotions. Usually you don't just get handed salary increases. You have to ask for them. Usually don't just get offered new role opportunities. You usually have to express the need to get that. And women in particular don't ask. They've been trained since they were children that if you just are quiet and you do your work well, then you'll be recognized, when you're worthy of that thing. A way that we can qualify this was HP did a 2014 study where they looked at internal job applications. And they saw that men would apply for a job when they met 60% of the qualifications listed on the job description. But women would only apply when they met every single item listed on a job description. And I'm guilty of this. I've written job descriptions. They are a wish list. They are not, a real reality. So I've tried to cut my job descriptions down purely because of this reason. And I actually experienced this. I met a CEO, and he was talking to me about he wanted to hire a woman for a senior role in the C-suite. But she, read the job description and she cited a specific example on page 3 she didn't have any experience for. And so that made her decide not to go for the role. And then he later asked the man who accepted the role, what he thought about that same requirement. And he said he never even read the 3rd page. So this is a massive thing that exists in the industry. You just have to recognize that men are going to be much more likely to speak up, or certain profiles will, and people in your team will be too uncomfortable to ask. So we just have to assume that people in the team constantly are too uncomfortable to ask, but they do want more. So how can we tease that out of individuals. So how do we empower managers and leaders to just assume this by default and then make it their duty to actually go out and find out each person's truth and their goals and find out what it is that they want? So how do you do that? To me, it's about structured career plans. So how do we make sure that we get everyone to do the individual work to understand like what motivates them, what job do they want in the future, and what skills do they have to learn now so that they will be able to get that job? So everyone in my org has this very structured career plan that we update every 6 months. And what one exercise that we do in this template is this motivations exercise. And anyone can do this on your own, and it's a really interesting thing to kind of do every 6 months. And the goal is if you had 100 points to spend across these different areas, and it can be other areas if you're motivated by different things, how would you distribute these 100 points? And this is a great tool to have a conversation with your managers so they can understand what is important to you. And you can even add an extra column next to the points that says, out of 5 today, how well is this being met? And it's a great way to communicate, actually, you've got dissatisfaction, that your job doesn't align to what you're motivated by. So maybe you need to make some changes in the work that you're doing. The rest of the career plan is kind of 5 key areas. The first thing is to really zoom out. So it's like, what is the job that you want in 5 years from now? Once you've identified that, it's like, hey, yeah, I want to be a manager of a team, or I want to work on a certain kind of product. Then we look at, okay, well, what skills do you need to learn now that could springboard you into that job? And like articulating those skills. And then we say, okay, well, knowing that you have to get that experience, what are the goals we're going to set for the next 6 months? They're going to help you get those skills so you can get that longer term job. And finally, who are the stakeholders or peers that we have to give visibility of your work so that you will be able to get recognized for those things? This last point is really important because women and people from minority backgrounds tend to not get enough visibility because they tend to speak up less or be recognized less. So we have to be more strategic about making sure that you're meeting the right people, that you're talking about the work you're doing, and that you're planning and managing that as well as you are planning and managing your work, because we tend to just leave that last bit and just forget to speak about the work we're doing. Okay, then finally, as a manager, there's another thing that you can be doing. You should be strategic about how you allocate the work. Be conscious of all the work the team are doing, and the smaller contributions can tend to go unnoticed, the ones that don't get, all the fanfare and all the talk about in the all hands. But those are important. So make sure that they are still measurable and, can contribute towards someone's promotion or, performance reviews. And then on the other side of that, we have to keep an eye out for the smaller work, like the non-promotable tasks that get delegated to people. I call this office housework. This is tasks like ordering the food, booking the meetings, taking notes, like anything that is a non-promotable task. Research shows that certain groups of people, including women and people of color, are much more likely to be to volunteer themselves or be assigned this kind of work. And taking it on literally hurts their careers because they have less time to spend on promotable work. So we have to be more conscious of how this work is assigned and making sure that we share the load. So ensure that you are scheduling these tasks and rotating them, like taking the notes in the meeting. This is a simple one. Have a rotation and everyone does it in one meeting each, rather than having one person doing it. Because whoever is taking the notes, I guarantee, is contributing to the discussion a lot less than everyone else because they're focusing on listening and capturing. They're not thinking about, at what point they can offer their own opinion. Okay, so those are the 3 pillars that I've spoken to you about. I hope you've had a couple of insights, whether you're a manager or not, that you could bring back into your team to make it a little bit more inclusive from tomorrow. And I hope that you're inspired to speak up a bit and to try and implement a couple of these things. So thank you so much for your time today. That's my presentation done, and I'm looking forward to some Q&A. Let me stop sharing so you can see my face a bit bigger.
Well, thanks, Melanie. That's great. No, I love those 3 pillars. And yeah, I don't think there's anyone watching who isn't super impressed with those gingerbread houses. They look amazing.
I was so close to Bake Off. I was final round, but it was the summer before my wedding. So that would have been crazy to have done that. The final was going to get filmed the week before my wedding. So
wow.
I don't think that would have been a good idea.
Awesome. If anyone has any questions, please submit them now. Many of those stats you shared at the beginning are kind of appalling, aren't they? But sadly, not surprising. I think kind of every industry kind of has a massive diversity and inclusion issue. But no, I think from your talk, I think there's kind of a lot we can learn about how we can be more inclusive. I mean, even like those kind of tiny tweaks to meetings, I mean, can obviously kind of make such a difference. I mean, kind of what advice would you give kind of to those kind of wanting to affect change upwards when it comes to so like kind of speaking to the top table, who may be blinded by thinking they're the perfect company and nothing needs to change? That can be quite an awkward conversation, right? What would be your advice for kind of anyone approaching that?
Yeah, number one thing is data. How can you gather data that can't be argued against? Like, how can you survey individuals or try to get some data and numbers that support what you're guessing is that maybe the environment isn't that inclusive? So you can either talk, partner with someone in HR and see, like, are we doing any surveys? Like, is there any insight that we can be sharing? There's some tools with psychological safety in particular, like some surveys that a team can do to measure how much psychological safety they have. And I see that on a scale, and like that can be another data input to say, like, yes, like we're not in a great place. Like, how should we be moving forward? And the other thing that you can do is so much research online that shows how having inclusion embedded in the culture of a team improves the revenue output of the business. Okay. So if you try to combine the fact that, like, hey, this is what we have today and it's not good, like, here's what the numbers show, here's how our employees are feeling, here's some quotes from people, like, anonymized, and then if we improved our inclusion, here's what's available to us, like, this is what other companies have done, and this is how much extra money they have made as a business by improving the inclusion. And kind of start the conversation that way. But the sharing, quotes and insight from how the organization feels is usually the most impactful way to try and make change.
Thank you. So I have a question here that's from anonymous attendee. How do you support and further these concepts when you are not a manager?
Exactly. Yes. So a lot of these concepts that I shared, an individual can start themselves. Like, if you have an idea around, okay, well, I want to try the technique of, how we're going to share the notes, or how we're going to, set up Q&As during meetings where they're like, we all take our turn to unmute, is that you can just make that a suggestion to the team. Like, those concepts can kind of catch on. Then the other, like, larger changes like the career plan and those things, you don't have to do those with a manager. Like, you can do a career plan, you can write that yourself, you can identify a mentor, or a sponsor, or someone who can help you, who you can do that with. Unfortunately, another piece of work that I'm involved in is well-being in the workplace, and we're trying to encourage people to have more well-being based conversations, and we've seen that not everyone has psychological safety to have those kinds of deep conversations with their managers, and that's just the reality of the environment, because people feel like if they open up about, oh, I want a job that's not in this job, like I don't want to work for you anymore, like that will be held against them, and they're trying to protect their job and their interests. So maybe identifying someone else who can be that advocate for you so that you can kind of have that environment. The other thing is, to like write down a couple of your ideas and then try to share them with other individuals, so you can build up a little bit of like a cohort of people who are interested in like implementing that idea. It's so much easier to change something if you have more than one person who are supporting it as an initiative, because when it gets introduced, when in the forum or wherever it is that you might be talking about it, if you have someone else to echo that and say, yes, I'm also supporting it, like that is so much more convincing, because people love community, they love being accepted as a society. So if you have multiple voices talking about the same thing, the rest of the group is much more likely to accept that idea and like to try and implement it. So if your manager sees that there's 2 or 3 of you saying, yes, I want to change how our meetings run, they're much more likely to take it seriously. So try and kind of build up that support with a few other people to back the idea.
Awesome, thank you. And kind of thinking about kind of what kind of organizations as a whole can do. I mean, how could they kind of identify gaps in kind of the different various teams they have? Kind of, I know some people do kind of, anonymous feedback. Kind of what advice would you give there?
Yeah, so like Google publishes its diversity stats, and even Google has a long way to go. And so some of the techniques that we have is that we do an annual employee survey. We ask a number of questions around, how you feel like you do have, do you belong in your team? Do you belong in your organization? Do you feel like your opinion is understood? Like lots of angles of like, is it inclusive for you as an individual? And then that data gets taken and it gets given, like managers can see like how their team is kind of scoring their environment. So you can see the data split up by a group. And then we tend to have a lot of actions that are formed after that survey happens each year. But that's like a lagging metric because it's only once a year that you get that insight. So we try to have other techniques that we can implement, like the psychological safety survey. And also every 6 months, managers have a process where individuals can submit like anonymous feedback and ratings for like all different angles of, there's 10 different questions about what it's like to work in that team. So I guess it's all about how do you get feedback? How do you get this insight continually from individuals so that you can understand like what's going on in the environment? I think if you don't have those techniques in place, you can kind of replicate that by creating regular forums where people can share feedback, anonymously, or retrospectives that happen without any leaders in the room. Where notes are taken anonymously. So, no one can then be blamed for the opinion that gets shared afterwards. So there are ways to kind of share that insight if you're individuals with an organization that's not facilitating it.
Awesome, thank you. And yeah, I was quite interested to know kind of, how can, so for example, a manager that's watched this talk and kind of wants to make changes, but it's a constant kind of learning process. I imagine kind of how can managers kind of identify, if perhaps they're going wrong somewhere, for example, kind of, excluding kind of more introverted people who kind of may not speak up and kind of tell them they're going wrong. Kind of, how would you recommend kind of those leaders kind of analyze their own performance kind of when it comes to inclusivity?
Yeah, so this is the power of like 360 feedback and surveys. Well, firstly, you can look at like, are people staying in your team? Like, do you have a good retention and attrition? And just looking at the diversity of your team, like, do you have a spectrum of, or do you have a group of people that are not representative of a broader group? Like those can be really important signals for you to say like, hey, maybe I'm not intentionally putting enough effort into cultivating this kind of environment. But yeah, then, collecting anonymous feedback. Sometimes when I worked in a company that hasn't had like, structured performance feedback that happens regularly, I will just send, an anonymous Google web form to the individuals in the team, and they can see that this is clearly anonymous. And I'm like, here's some questions like, what do you think I'm doing well as a leader, and what can I do to improve? And anyone can write anything in there, and it's like, there's not going to be any repercussion of that, and it's kind of outside any formal tool. So just like, how can you collect insight? How can you get opinion? And then, just asking people, like in a one-to-one, spend some time in that meeting to say, what could I be doing to be better? Always assume that you could be doing better. Like that's the first thing. Don't think that you're amazing. And then like a question of like, do I need to be better? Like an individual's not going to feel comfortable to say, yeah, you're bad. But if you start with the assumption that there's always room to improve and say like, I can definitely improve and I want you to help me figure out what else I could be doing, and kind of open that door is a good way. And ask someone, if you have someone who you feel like is from an underrepresented group and you're speaking to them, to say like, what could this team or me as an individual be doing to better empower you? And I'm sure you're going to get a lot of interesting insight. Rarely asked that question.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Melanie. That was awesome. And yeah, thanks to everyone that's tuned in as well. Yeah, we'd love to hear everyone's feedback from the week. We'll be sending out a form. We've I hope everyone's found the talks as enjoyable as we have. I've got a little bit ahead of myself earlier, and we will be sending out all video links to the talks on Monday, and not today, so I apologize for that. Personally, I'd like to thank Liam, Claire, Imi, Lauren and Catherine from the marketing team here at Nomensa for making this all happen. And yeah, we're really excited that our in-person events here at Nomensa are going to be back next year. So look out for details on Interact London, Interact Amsterdam and Collaborate Bristol. That we should have details for you in the new year. And yeah, we'd love to see you there. Melanie, again, thank you so much. And yeah, to everyone else, we'll see you next year. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.